Good evening. It is 2:17 a.m. Eastern Time. Inside the White House residence, the most powerful leader in the free world is awake, alone, watching cable news. A panel discussion about Canadian dairy tariffs has just ended. The president is agitated. He picks up his phone. He types 140 characters. He presses send. And then he goes back to sleep. In that single moment, before any legal review, before any consultation with his cabinet, his commerce secretary, his trade representative, or his legal counsel, the largest bilateral trade relationship on earth was frozen solid. $900 billion in annual commerce, 8 million American jobs, the energy supply for 6 states, the water source for 40 million people, all of it halted by a thumb and a social media post composed in the dark. While that tweet hung in the digital ether, the machinery of the American government began to seize. The Commerce Secretary was woken by an aide and told the President had just announced a total ban on all Canadian goods. There was no executive order. There was no implementing guidance. The Secretary called the White House. The Chief of Staff had also just learned from his phone. He called the President's assistant, who confirmed that the President had gone back to bed. By 4 a.m., the practical reality of the chaos was cascading. Customs and Border Protection officers at 37 border crossings stood next to trucks full of Canadian goods, staring at their own phones, waiting for instructions that did not exist. At the Ambassador Bridge, the busiest commercial crossing in North America, trucks began to line up for miles. Rail cars full of crude oil from Alberta approached the border on tracks that cannot be rerouted. Container ships carrying Canadian lumber circled off East Coast ports, told by harbor authorities, "Stand by. We don't know if you can unload." For 6 hours, the border was in limbo. 6 hours of idling trucks, stopped trains, and billions of dollars in commerce suspended in a state of uncertainty. And here is the detail that captures the absurdity. Trump's own legal team spent the entire morning trying to draft an executive order that would provide legal authority for what the tweet had already announced. They were working backward, trying to make something legal that the president had already declared to the world. But here is where the story pivots in a way that no one in Washington anticipated. Because while the American capital was drowning in its own chaos, another capital was eerily calm. In Ottawa, at 2:45 a.m., the phone rang in the residence of the Prime Minister, Mark Carney. He was briefed. He did not panic. He did not react with anger. He simply initiated a sequence that had been months in the making, because Mark Carney had been preparing for this, not for this specific tweet, but for the general scenario of an impulsive maximalist trade action. His team had war-gamed dozens of scenarios, a total ban, a partial ban, an energy embargo. Each scenario had a pre-built response playbook, stress-tested and ready. The phone numbers of allied leaders were preloaded into a secure system. Draft diversification agreements had been pre-negotiated to the point where they needed only a signature and a triggering event. The only thing Carney needed was the trigger, and Donald Trump provided it at 2:17 a.m. Within 4 hours, Carney had executed a series of moves that would transform the ban from a potential crisis into a strategic opportunity. By 3 a.m., his national security team was assembled on a secure call. By 3:30 a.m., the response sequence was authorized, and by 6 a.m., before the sun was fully up on the East Coast, Carney was on the phone with the Prime Minister of India, the President of the European Commission, and the Prime Ministers of Japan and the United Kingdom. The message to each was identical and devastatingly precise. The United States has just demonstrated its unreliability in the most dramatic fashion possible. Canada is now available as a full-capacity trading partner for any nation that wants a stable, democratic supply of energy, critical minerals, and goods. They didn't hesitate. They had been watching the deterioration for months. By noon, Canada had signed emergency trade frameworks with 3 major economies. The Canadian dollar, which had initially plunged, began to recover. By market close, the Dow Jones Industrial Average had lost 1,200 points and was still falling. Warren Buffett would later say that the impulsive always lose to the prepared, and called the tweet a gift to Canada that Trump doesn't know he gave. So, as we watch this geopolitical drama unfold, we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question. In an era where a single impulsive social media post can upend the global economy, What does it actually mean to be a reliable partner? And more importantly, if you were leading your country, would you bet your future on a relationship that can be canceled at 2:17 a.m. by a television segment? We want to hear your thoughts on this. Share your perspective in the comments section below. Let's continue the conversation. What happened in those 4 hours is a masterclass in strategic response. Let's break it down. Move 1, the diversification calls. These weren't frantic diplomatic scrambles, they were executions of a pre-written plan. The India Critical Minerals Partnership, covering lithium, nickel, and potash, was expanded via an emergency procurement agreement. The European Union fast-tracked a resource partnership with new provisions for energy and agricultural products. Japan signed an emergency energy supply agreement guaranteeing Canadian crude oil access through the Trans Mountain Pipeline. These agreements had been drafted months earlier, waiting in diplomatic pouches for a trigger. Trump's tweet was that trigger. Move 2, the moral authority play. At 6:15 a.m., Carney held a press conference. His tone was measured, calm, authoritative. He did not match Trump's energy. He simply stated the facts. At 2:17 this morning, the President of the United States announced a total ban on goods from America's closest ally via a social media post. There was no consultation. There was no legal process. The announcement appears to have been prompted by a late-night television segment about dairy tariffs. He let the absurdity of that sentence hang in the air. Then he delivered the line that would be quoted in foreign ministries around the world. If this is how the United States treats Canada, its neighbor of 250 years, its NORAD partner, then every country should ask itself, how reliable is any American commitment if it can be revoked by a tweet before sunrise? That framing was inarguably true, and it reframed America's reliability in the eyes of the entire world. Move 3 was resource redirection. With the ban providing the justification, Carney announced that Canada would immediately begin redirecting exports to the new partners who wanted them. Canadian crude oil would be redirected to Asian markets through the Trans Mountain Pipeline. Canadian critical minerals would be redirected to Europe and India. And then came the move that sent shockwaves through 6 American states. Carney announced an immediate review of all cross-border electricity export agreements. New York, Vermont, Maine, New Hampshire, Minnesota, and Michigan all depend on Canadian hydroelectric power. The power flows through physical cables that cross the border. There are no alternative sources. The electricity review wasn't a retaliatory tariff. It was the quiet threat of the lights going out. It got the attention of 6 governors within the hour. As Carney stated, if the United States has decided it doesn't want Canadian goods, then perhaps it also doesn't want Canadian electricity. We will ensure that Canadian energy serves the interests of Canada and its willing partners first. The ban, intended to punish, instead freed Canada from any obligation to prioritize American supply. Move 4 was what we might call market judo. By mid-morning, the financial markets had processed the situation and delivered a verdict that was not what the author of the tweet intended. Traders realized what policy analysts took longer to understand. The ban hurt the United States more than it hurt Canada. American supply chains were frozen. Canadian supply chains were being rerouted to eager new partners. By noon, the Canadian dollar had recovered its losses and was actually strengthening. By market close, the Dow had lost 200 points. The markets figured it out before Washington did. One analyst put it succinctly, "The ban is an American supply chain crisis. Canada has alternatives. America doesn't." Warren Buffett reached at his home in Omaha that afternoon, offered his perspective with the clarity of 6 decades of investment experience. He explained why the ban, in effect, was a gift. It gave Canada 5 things it didn't have at 2:16 a.m. First, urgency. Diversification was no longer a long-term goal. It was an immediate necessity. Deals that would have taken months were signed in hours. Second, moral authority. Canada was the aggrieved party, wronged by a late-night tweet. Third, legal justification. The ban voided long-term supply contracts, freeing Canada to sell to others. Fourth, political unity. Nothing unifies a country like an external attack. And fifth, negotiating leverage. When the ban inevitably reversed, Canada would come to the table with diversification deals already signed and a population unified behind its position. The ban began collapsing within 48 hours. It had to. The American economy couldn't absorb it. Auto manufacturers announced that assembly lines would shut down within 72 hours without Canadian parts. Ford, GM, and Stellantis warned of plant closures and furloughs. Energy companies warned of refinery shutdowns within 2 weeks. Northern state governors, including Republicans, issued emergency statements demanding the ban be reversed before their constituents lost electricity. The governor of New York pointed out that the state receives significant portions of its power from Quebec Hydro. If Canadian electricity stops flowing, he said, the lights go out, not metaphorically, literally. The Farm Bureau warned of fertilizer shortages. Congress signaled it would override the ban legislatively. On Thursday morning, 71 hours after the tweet, the White House announced the ban would be phased and modified to protect critical supply chains. Washington languaged for a complete reversal. By the following Monday, Canadian goods were crossing the border normally. The tweet, the chaos, the panic, the 200-point drop, all of it resolved back to the status quo in less than a week. Except it wasn't for nothing, not for Canada, because here is what did not reverse when the ban reversed. The diversification deals Carney signed during those 4 critical hours are permanent. They are binding international agreements. The India Minerals Agreement commits Canadian exports for a decade. The EU Resource Partnership creates new supply channels. The Japan Energy Framework locks in Canadian crude oil access. The UK Trade Acceleration opens new markets. None of these agreements expire when the ban expires. They are structural, permanent shifts in Canadian trade architecture that will redirect tens of billions of dollars in annual commerce away from the United States for decades to come. The ban lasted 72 hours. The diversification deals will last a generation. Every barrel of Canadian oil that now flows to Tokyo instead of Houston is a permanent loss to the American market. Every ton of potash that now ships to Mumbai instead of Des Moines is a permanent shift. Every kilowatt of electricity that is now reviewed and potentially redirected is a permanent change in the energy landscape. The tweet is deleted. The consequences are forever. The moral authority Carney gained is equally irreversible. Every future trade negotiation Canada enters now begins with an implicit context that strengthens its position. Canada is the country that was banned by its closest ally via a 2 a.m. social media post that responded with calm, strategic precision, that signed 3 major trade frameworks before lunch, and that came out of the crisis stronger than it went in. That is not just a trade position, it is a brand. And brands attract partners. India didn't accelerate the minerals deal out of charity. The EU didn't fast-track the resource partnership out of sympathy. They did it because a country that responds to chaos with strategy is a country you want to do business with. Reliability is the most valuable currency in international trade. And Carney just demonstrated that Canada has it in a way that the United States at this moment demonstrably does not. A tweet at 2:17 a.m., no legal review, no cabinet consultation, no interagency process, no understanding of the consequences for American supply chains, American workers, or American credibility. A man saw something on television that made him angry, picked up his phone, typed 140 characters that froze $900 billion in annual trade, and went to bed. And within 4 hours before the man who sent the tweet had even woken up, the target of that anger had turned the attack into the most significant strategic repositioning in Canadian economic history. Diversification deals that would have taken years of patient diplomacy were signed in hours. Moral authority that would have taken decades of reputation building was established in a single 6-minute press conference. Resource redirection that would have faced fierce domestic resistance was justified overnight. And the cost to the United States, 200 points off the Dow, 71 hours of border chaos, the permanent diversion of billions in annual Canadian exports, the permanent loss of the assumption that American trade commitments are reliable, that cost is real, it is measurable, and it will compound for years. Donald Trump tried to isolate Canada. Instead, he connected Canada to the world. He tried to demonstrate American power. Instead, he demonstrated American unreliability to every ally on earth. He tried to punish the country that supplies America's energy, its water, its minerals, its lumber, and its auto parts. Instead, he gave that country every reason, every opportunity, and every justification to find someone else to sell them to. And Canada is finding them, quickly, permanently, with the enthusiastic support of partners who are now lining up because they saw what happened. They want to be on the side of the country that responds to chaos with strategy, rather than the country that creates chaos with a phone. The impulsive always lose to the prepared, and at 2:17 a.m., the most powerful man in the world gave his closest neighbor a gift he will never understand he gave. That is our broadcast for this evening. Please hit the bell icon and subscribe to my channel for daily updates.